Alrighty. So continuing with our list of evidence, we're going to look at comparative anatomy. So what are the structures of organisms and how do they relate to one another? So when we look at homologous body structures, you should recognize the word homologous, meaning similar but not identical. And so here we're talking about structures that are very similar because they come from the same basic form, but have evolved differences due to differences in function. So if you look at this picture over here, we have a human hand, we have a cat's paw, we have a whale's flipper, and we have a bat's wing. Obviously, we know on a functional level, all of those organisms use their limbs in very different ways. But when we take a look at their skeletal structure, we're going to notice some some similarities. So we see that there are similar bone groupings that are highlighted here based on the coloring. Now notice that the bones don't all look identical, okay, because over time, as each organism had a different use for the limb, random mutations that produce these variations were selected for. So obviously in a bat, for example, you're going to see a very reduced humerus, that's this upper arm bone, and you're going to see that the phalanges, or the fingers, have been very long and extended. And that makes sense because, when you think about a wing, you want to be as light as possible, so you don't want these big, thick, heavy bones, weighing you down, okay? And sometimes there's fusion that has occurred, like you see all those little tiny wrist bones. It doesn't look like they have as much movement in their wings. And you can see here that in the whale, they've greatly reduced the size of these two bones that we have in our arm. It's called your radius and your ulna, because their flippers are needed for sturdiness. So they're meant to be short and sturdy. So their bones are going to be thicker, so that they can, take the water pressure as they push their bodies through the water. So homologous, similar basic structure, but very different functions. Why do they have those similarities? Because they evolved from a common ancestor. Okay, and here's just another look at that. This is the reason why it supports the theory. When we see all of these similarities in bone structure, yet we know functionally each organism uses them very differently, we can say, why would they have any similarities in the first place? So when we look back into ancient times and we look at a common ancestor, which would be a lobe-finned fish, remember from the fossil record where we looked at transitional fossils, we actually see evidence of these beginning bone groupings. So the reason why we have this bone layout, and why we share this among organisms, is because we are going to inherit that from our ancestors. On the other hand, we can have analogous body structures. So this is going to be the opposite of homologous structures, but it's still going to support evolution. So in this case, the structures may look very different, but they have the same function. So if you have a different basic structure but a similar function, then differences in those structure indicates that they don't share a recent ancestor. Okay, so why would they have similar function? They have similar pressures in the environment. So here is an example of convergent evolution where the structure evolved separately in two different lineages. So when we look at the wings of a bat and the wings of a butterfly, bats are made of bone. Butterflies, they're not made of bone at all. Okay, they're made of a carbohydrate that is used to give their body's strength, but it's not bone. Okay, it's not calcified like a skeletal system. So they're completely different structures. However, no one can argue that a bat and a butterfly both use their wings to fly. So why do they have a similar trait? Well, they both need to fly because of pressures in their environment. They just developed the ability to fly separately from one another. So it's not the result of a common ancestor. And possibly some of the most interesting evidence of comparative anatomy are vestigial body structures. So if a structure is vestigial, that means it was once useful and had a good shape and good function, but over time, over evolutionary time, so we're talking millions of years and lots of generations, we have seen that structure become so reduced in size and function that it no longer has a role in an organism. So for example, whales have a vestigial hip bone. So why would whales need a hip bone? When you think about what we have hips for, we have hips to hold our femur, and our femur is our thigh bone, which indicates that whales share a common ancestor with organisms that had legs. So when whales evolved from a common ancestor that had legs and they moved back into the water, variations in the early ancestors of whales did not need those legs anymore. And so slowly over time, they became so reduced in structure and function that we barely see any leftover of them. This is also true in humans. It's kind of weird to think about, but when you are first born, not when you're first born. When you are first conceived and the embryo starts to develop, early fetal development shows that humans have a tail structure. Why on earth would we have a tail structure? Or even in the picture here, they're showing the gill slits that we see, again, in very, very early development. So why do we have these leftover body parts if we as humans have no need for them? It relates again to common ancestry. It indicates that somewhere in our lineage, we were related to organisms that did have gill slits and a tail. So some really interesting stuff there. We'll talk in class about more vestigial body structures, and we'll talk about the appendix as one of them as well. Skinks are the last example of a vestigial structure. Looking at a type of lizard here, in some of the species, depending on their environment, the legs have become so small and so reduced in size that they can no longer use them for walking. So it's not that this happens over an organism's lifetime. It's that these skinks are born this way. So this is a heritable trait that is being passed down from generation to generation. So why would an organism possess an organ with little or no function? The explanation and the way that it supports the theory of evolution is that it's a leftover or a vestige from an ancestor at one point that did have legs. So again, just some really cool pieces of evidence to take a look at here. Our fourth piece of evidence related to homology and comparative anatomy is embryology. So take a look at these embryos and look at what organisms they all come from. If we played a matching game, how many of you think you could correctly match the early embryo with its final organism, with what it eventually looks like when it's born later? You couldn't, right? So why do we see so many similarities in early embryos of these animals that all have backbones? Again, it is pointing to a common ancestor. So the way that we develop early on in life is the way that our early ancestors developed in life. And then due to differences in our environment, random mutations that produce variations were acted on by those differences in those environments, and they were selected for. So our mature forms, right, look very different, but early embryology shows that we all look extremely similar early in development, again, pointing to a common ancestor. And this is what I just said about that. We've seen this image before, looking at the zygote going into that cleavage stage where you have lots of mitosis occurring, and then those cells start to organize into what's going to give rise to the organism on the inside and the placenta on the outside. And so then once you have that basic shape, you're then going to start having more of the cell migration, and you're going to have differentiation of cells start to occur. And early on, we share a lot of that differentiation. You know, when you look at organisms that have a backbone, we have a lot of the same body systems. And while our mature forms have made differences in those body systems, the fact that they have them means that they're going to start from the same type of development. And so that's why we see the similarities. The last piece of DNA is our most recent and also our most compelling, looking at molecular evidence. So we can compare body structures and functions all we want, but that's still very qualitative data, and it still can be argued. However, what is the blueprint for the body? It is the DNA and then the protein that's made for that DNA. So when we look at comparisons between organisms and we look at similarities and differences in DNA, it tells us how closely or distantly related we are on a molecular level to other organisms. And so here you see an image looking at amino acids inside one protein that we make, hemoglobin, right? Hemoglobin is going to be essential for helping us carry oxygen. All of these organisms need oxygen in order to survive. So all of these organisms have oxygen. But how they make their hemoglobin, the blueprint that's used for that, tells a story about relatedness. So you see humans at the top there, right? That's what we're comparing to. A rhesus monkey, right, another primate just like us, would have very much in common with us, okay? Because of how we share a lot in common with them, it suggests that we are more closely related to them. Am I saying that humans and monkeys are cousins of each other? My goodness, no. What we're trying to say is that the more closely related organisms are, the more they are going to share similarities in their DNA and protein sequences. So this indicates we share a more recent common ancestor than we share with chicken, right? There's only 69% in common with a chicken. So wherever our branch left and gave rise to chickens versus humans, that happened much further back in evolutionary time compared to the branch that split between other primates like monkeys and things like that versus humans. And just to talk a little bit about some evidence looking at our primate ancestry, I thought this was kind of interesting. So humans have a diploid number of 46, right? We have 46 chromosomes arranged into 23 homologous pairs, but all other primates have 48. And so if we are saying that there was a divergence, we have to be able to explain how there was this reduction in chromosome number, right? This led to the different branch so that our primate common ancestor differed from us and modern primate species today. So where did this difference come from? Some really cool research has been done, and we have found out that it looks as though that extra pair that all primates have, you see the bonobos, you see the chimpanzees, and you see gorillas, they have 48. That extra pair may have, as a result of a mutation, right, early in the formation of human species, fused together. So if you look at this picture in chimps, if you align their chromosomes that are two separate homologous chromosomes, right? If you line them up in such a way, it matches very carefully to the banding pattern of our uniquely long chromosome number 2, right? Can you see the way the banding pattern is? And this is an image showing how these chromosomes would stain. This similarity in structure when two of the chimpanzee's chromosomes are sort of lined up provides evidence that that may be where we broke in our ancestry, that there was a fusion that occurred through a random mutation and it produced a single fused chromosome, and that that is where the diploid number changes.